Help support this channel and get early access to videos, plus exclusive content and patrons-only live discussions by becoming a member at patreon.com/BrucePoinsett. Yeah. So, Emily, thank you for joining me this afternoon. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Super excited to chat and appreciate the interview invitation.
Yeah, no, it's always a pleasure. You're like one of these people. One, you're a colleague, but then also someone whose work I definitely just like, I'm inspired by. I look to you both in the work, but then also in just like the way you move as a working artist. And, like you're able to, I mean, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the different just streams, different things you do. But I mean, between writing, being a DJ, speaking, teaching, you know, you're you're all over the place and like, but in the best way. And yeah, I think it's very instructive, indicative of, again, it's kind of like the life of a working artist in this area. But to kind of get to that point, so you have right by you see Funeral for Flocka, and yeah, I want to talk about, just because that's a journey that's still going. But yeah, just I mean, even like with the title, so I know it's around just kind of like struggles you have with body image, but can you just talk about like what that means?
Yeah, well, thanks also for the kudos, and definitely things are all over the place as many working artists are. And the inspiration is mutual. I really admire everything that you're doing. So just wanted to note that real quick. But yeah, Funeral for Flaca is my essay collection. It is called Funeral for Flaca because one of the essays in it imagines a scene in which I lay my childhood nickname of Flaca, which means skinny girl, to rest. Essentially, I my body changed as I became an adult, and at a certain point, I noticed that everyone around me stopped calling me Flaca, including my own father, which was one of like the few constants in our pretty strained relationship growing up, and so that was really painful. Not only from losing sort of what I felt like was a term of endearment, but then also the complex feelings of having a nickname that is tied to my body, especially with someone who struggled with body image and disordered eating. And so the collection is essentially a coming of age story, beginning when I was about 5 years old to 29 when I wrote the book. And in addition to examining themes of body and food and culture and family relations, there's also a musical component where each essay is a song, so it's actually a playlist instead of just a table of contents, as a nod to my DJ roots. And there's also a lot about honestly finding my way and figuring out sort of where I belong when so much of my youth was spent figuring out like what subculture I could be a part of, what boxes I could put myself in, and ultimately as someone who was a prep, was a punk, was a chola, was indie, whatever you want to call it, and being a mix of all those things, and being Mexican American and bisexual and having mental health struggles, all those things combined, there is like no neat and tidy box. And so that's a lot of what the journey of the essay collection is coming to that realization and being comfortable with being who I am outside of maybe a tidy box.
Yeah, and there's, just I think about essays, and you kind of just like talk about just like processing all those experiences, those emotions. And it's just like, one, just like writing it out and getting it down just to begin with is, I imagine, like it gets a little bit, maybe lifts a little bit off your shoulders, is just great for processing. But like when I think about, because it started out as a chapbook, correct?
Yeah.
And this
Mhm.
was how many years ago?
The chapbook was 2019. I actually have a copy of it right here.
Hmm.
I prepared. And so it basically is about half as long and came out as a school project, basically at the Independent Publishing Resource Center. And then I submitted it for publication through the local press Future Tense Books. And that's when it got picked up and then reissued again and expanded, revised in 2021.
And can you just talk about like, because it's gone from chapbook to published, award winning, you've taken it on tour, uh, you know, have conversations and workshops around it. Can you just talk about like growing kind of the just the like engagement and these opportunities to, you know, like publishing a book in itself is a big thing, but just like just the legs that this has had.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has just been honestly learning as much as I can as I'm going. I didn't come from a sort of traditional MFA background originally. My upbringing to writing in general was sort of first through internships, post college, and then doing a lot of community workshops. So maybe some of the knowledge that certain people might gain from the MFA, I didn't really get about how the publishing industry worked. So that on one hand is a barrier and a challenge, but on the other hand, it's also the opportunity to be innovative and do things scrappy and DIY. And so I think just from the beginning, one of the biggest uh, process that I undertook that I think contributed to it having legs, as you said, so to speak, is documenting a lot of the process along the way, and really celebrating every bit of it. So on my Instagram, there's like a stories highlight because as I was making the chapbook originally, I would show folks behind the scenes of like, hey, here's me figuring out how to use InDesign and like print out these copies. And I'm so proud of this risograph cover I made. And look, I selected the paper. And oh my gosh, I'm cutting all these books and binding them together by hand. And I think it's just an opportunity to, for myself, document the process, but also showcase that these things, if you can find the right space to have access to the tools, are available to people. And when the chapbook came out, I also treated it like a real book, quote unquote, a published book where I did a book launch and I reached out to a local bar and asked them if I could host it, and I brought people and I made flyers and invited readers. And so I think just along the way, I was trying to always celebrate it. And with it becoming a book, with Future Tense, that was an opportunity to kind of revisit the project and think about sort of structurally, okay, if I'm really creating a narrative that people will read, what do I need to fill in, right? So that kind of led to more of a creative process of writing new essays and revising essays. And then again, with that sort of marketing and publicity side, I just hit the ground running. Like I took a publicity class, and created a giant spreadsheet where I kept track of, okay, I need to send press releases to different outlets. And I learned about trade reviews and all these things. And it was overwhelming sometimes, but also I just wanted to give my book the best chance that I could, working with a really small press with basically 1 to 2 people on the press. A lot of it kind of fell on me. But I think that's where, again, resources like community workshops, the Authors Guild has a ton of webinars, and like I had them review the contract, and using social media to also connect with people who I could read with on book tour, using social media to fundraise for a book tour. All of this was really just community based and infused throughout. And I don't know, what it will look like for the next book that I'm working on and what it might look like to work with a different publisher. But I think no matter what, it's like people who can be supportive of you as readers, but also fellow creatives and fellow, also just friends, right, to support you have been essential, I think, to the growth, right? It can never be just me on my own because it's nothing without the people who want to talk about it, want to read it, right, want to engage with it.
You talk about just like how it can sometimes be, overwhelming, just all that, again, like constant documentation, sometimes I imagine feel a little bit tedious, but I think it's also important just for people to understand like how much work it takes. Like I feel like a lot of us, we look at social media, we look at some of these other, especially like marketing tactics, decisions, kind of like passively, or think it's, just a thing someone can just quickly do. But I mean, if you were just ballparking like how much time, if you were like doing a ratio of like creation versus marketing, just with never mind all your work, but just with Funeral for Flocka, like Could you ballpark that?
That's a challenging question. I mean, it's also just hard because writing takes so long and editing takes so long. So there's also just like countless hours that I was writing and writing and writing. And then when it was getting published, having to reread the same thing over and over and over. Like I read my book probably like 10 times at least, which maybe isn't that much, but that feels like a lot to read uh one book, and that happens to be the one that I wrote already, right? So there's a lot of that in that creation process. But then the the marketing and sort of publicity and connecting and talking about it and trying to get like folks to invite me to speak about it, that is ongoing. And that's like forever, I feel like. Though I also believe that they become intertwined in a way as well, because um I recently read that like folks are more likely to buy your first book once you have a second book as well. Like obviously people can buy your first book, but the more books you write, the more those also work to help you get the word out about previous books. Like they're all new opportunities to find new readers. And so maybe at some point it's just going to be infused. Like when I'm writing, I'm also inadvertently supporting my book and the marketing of it. But I have no idea what the ratio would be. But I do think that it is a big part of my at least like monthly routine with my work. You know, when I think about my work as an artist, there is the creation process, but there's all the administrative, the financials, right? Invoicing, managing my soon to be payroll. Actually, I'm going to switch to a different business entity. All those things are way more hours, I think, if we're going to combine all the administrative tasks associated in order to make the art. But I hope maybe one day I'll be able to get support, maybe from an assistant, and also have advances and things like that so that I can hopefully tip those scales, because I think they're definitely imbalanced if we're thinking about the whole picture of being a working artist.
And it's funny. I feel like again we talk about some of the constants in these conversations, resources, but then I feel like I mean myself included, we're all on this dream of like one day we're gonna get that assistant. But
True.
you talked earlier about sort of like the also in the creative process having the chapters, having titles as song titles, having it also work as a playlist. And we get into the DJ background in a second, but in the book you also just talk about how big of an inspiration Tupac was to your writing, to your work. Can you just talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so uh, what I share, I have a talk that I give called Finding My Way to Funeral for Fleka, which Bruce, you will see that in person at Respond to Racism's event in April. But one of the things that I talk about is that when I was younger, I didn't really have books that I connected with. I didn't really see myself in TV. The place that I really felt emotionally connected to and seen was music. And a big part of that was Tupac's music. I really started listening to Tupac extensively in middle school. And one of the things that I really connected with, besides, the great beats, was like his lyrics. And a lot of his music is really radical. He comes from Black Panther, families, and just the Shakur family in general is an amazing revolutionary family. And that really comes through in his music, which, especially his earlier music. And that for me was an education just in learning how systems of oppression work, and sort of community responsibility, all these different levels to being in the world that I felt like I wasn't getting in school. And then I actually found a posthumous poetry book called The Rose That Grew from Concrete. And it's basically Tupac's writing on a binder of different lyrics and poems. And then those poems are then transcribed, into whatever font. So on each page, you can see the split. And that was super powerful for me when I was 13. Like, wow, I have binder paper. I like to write poems. And he used, I remember specifically like the number two instead of TO. And I was like, that's cool. I do that when I write on Instant Messenger. He sounds like people that I talked to, and it wasn't this really forced flourish language, like, which was what I thought that you had to sound like to write books. And I think that was a small green light for me, that books could look really different and books could be accessible and speak to what I felt like at the time was like real issues and the hardest things. I really didn't like fiction, especially like fantasy books at the time. I just thought there was like we live in a world that's, you know, real. Like, why would we read fantasy? Obviously, now I feel differently in that, like, I understand why people write other worlds, and I see the power in that as well, and the revolutionary power in like sci-fi. But at the time, it was really Tupac's music and that poetry book that felt like the permission to start to explore that. And so writing poetry and then also doing journaling in my diary were really, really intrinsic to one day eventually going and trying to publish articles, which didn't come for many years later, really. Um, so that's a little bit about Tupac.
It's interesting when we have a lot of different spaces where our paths cross and everything, including literary arts. And when I was thinking about just sort of like the Tupac inspiration, when I'm in classes, I got to do a hip hop lit class at Franklin this past spring. And part of that, we just asking the students, who do you listen to? And most of it is newer artists, like the older or more established artists on their list are like Kendrick Lamar and like J.
Yeah.
Cole and Drake, like, but consistently it was also like Tupac still comes up as far as like in that inspiration, the same way like when I think about uh like when I was in high school and we talked about artists before our time, it was like Jimi Hendrix and like Bob Marley and those things. And it's just interesting to see like who remains just like, and for many of the reasons you talked about, who remains so relevant even to this generation that was not alive when Tupac was alive. Like it's
Definitely.
fascinating. And
I mean,
also, oh, go
for
ahead.
better or worse, some of his music's really relevant, right? Like talking about disparities and, the treatment of like Black people and women and mothers and the social inequities of like class, right? Like all those things are unfortunately still very relevant. But also, I think that his music can be really inspiring as well, like by informing people. And then also, I mean, for me, the staying power is always like the nostalgia that I associate with that music as well. There's another essay that I would want to write one day that was also about his assaults, and that's something that I didn't explore in Funeral for Flaca. It didn't really feel like the right space for it, but it's something that I've also thought about as a survivor and also as someone whose life really was touched and shaped by Tupac, right? Like, how do you hold these two sort of conflicting things, right? It's really challenging.
Yeah, no, very much so. Now, it's very timely also with the Assault Survivors Act in New York, and
Mhm.
whether it be Diddy, you know,
Yeah.
Mayor Eric Adams in there, like,
Mm.
yeah, it's a time. You also you also plugged Respond to Racism, and you coming in to talk in April, because speaking of mutual connections and organizational connections, we recently started engaging with the group Hacienda CDC, and your name came up in that conversation. It's like, yeah, we work with Emily all the time. They were like really excited to hear that you were coming through.
That's
But
cool.
I mentioned specifically like the DJ work, and yeah, I was curious like what is the story as far as like how did you become a DJ, and how did you decide this is what I want to pursue, you know, as well as just like as a career in addition to writing?
It started out as a hobby, that sort of with writing, right? If I'm gonna retrace the roots, like the roots were there like way before I actually ever saw myself as a DJ. As far as like I was always a person, burning CDs for people and like writing out all the song tracks and then in like college doing an actual mixtapes because I thought it was like retro and cool and Um, some of my first articles for Bitch Media were actually this series called Bitch Tapes, where you would curate a playlist and then write about why you had picked the song. So there's some seeds there, I think, earlier, but it didn't really happen until like 2017. My cousin, Luz Selena Mendoza, who's part of La Bamba, they're the front person of La Bamba. They were like, "Hey, do you want to do a Latina DJ night at Holocene?" I was like, "I don't know how to DJ." And they were like, "No, it's all good. Like, just you can learn. It'll be easy, and like it'll just be really fun and low key. Let's just like play the tracks that we want to." I also think that X-Ray, before I was a DJ, sort of playing actual music and mixing and stuff like that. I was also a co-host on a talk show that also played music for X-Ray called Is Butter a Carb? And so there was like some seeds as far as understanding how to play tracks on. I don't think they use Serato, but they use some similar software, right? So I understood the basics of like you have tracks and then you can crossfade. And so with that limited knowledge, I borrowed a controller from my brother because he got into DJing for a little and then had stopped. And it turns out the crossfade was broken. So my first DJ night, and for a little bit of time until I could invest into my own controller that worked, was curating very carefully this playlist and then hitting play on beat whenever the songs would stop. But I was good at selecting songs. And so from there, it just sort of continued to grow, where then we had a monthly DJ night with what then became Noche Libre. I got a real controller where I could then learn how to not only crossfade, but then actually beat match, right? And it's just kind of really grown from there. And it wasn't until the last few years that I was really like, this is a viable business, because I would DJ here and there, but then, I got my first wedding gig, maybe in like 2019. And then I started to do DJing for nonprofits, for galas, and it just sort of organically grew. And now is at a point where it competes for the number one spot of how I make a living as an artist, which is really fun for me. It's amazing. And I love getting to, share the joy and the journey that people can go on through music. So it was not planned, it was not expected, and it's just been really surprisingly joyful and a different part of my brain too than writing articles or event producing. It's just this like mathematical but creative release in a different way that I really, really appreciate.
Mm. And do you have any, you just talk about some of like the different types of gigs, whether it be like weddings, nonprofits, these different types of events, but is there anyone in particular that just comes to mind as like, this was one of the most fun shows I've ever done, or this is one of the most memorable shows I've ever done?
I mean, I think that the Noche Libre nights, when they were really, really popping, and a lot of this is like, I think of it like pre-post pandemic, because that really just threw a wrench, I think, in my life as an artist, as a person, how I made a living. So there's this like really different period in there where literary arts came through, and I was working there full time. But pre-pandemic, Noche Libre nights at Dig a Pony were just the best. It was like at a time when people weren't really playing a lot of reggaeton or cumbias. Like now it's like all over the place, right? You can go to like, I don't know, a few bars, I feel like, in Portland, and it wouldn't be that wild to hear like reggaeton or cumbias. It wasn't as common during that time. Like that was like before I think Bad Bunny became a household name. But they were just, Noche Libre was a Latina DJ collective, or Latina DJ collective, and having all women DJs at that time, right, women identifying, playing a space and sort of controlling like who's there. Like we didn't necessarily have rules on who could be there, but it was a very queer friendly, women friendly, BIPOC centered space that I didn't see anywhere in Portland at the time. And at least not like Latinas focused, right? And I just think the energy of that was so electric. Like the staff at Digapony were always so kind, and if there ever was any like a rare occasion of like a bro being too drunk, they would just get kicked out. We had some themed days, especially there was one that was like Galentine's, and it was just all queer, cute people with like, you know, great visuals and stuff. So I think some of my favorite moments are those like moments that were more intimate, and the music was really up to us, right? And there's been a lot of amazing shows since then, right? Like I've been able to support a lot of musical acts, like as being an opener. And so there's just so many. Like I also recently DJ'd for Latino Network Gala, and there was like 700 people just like getting down on the dance floor. I also love weddings because I love the joy and, you know, to hear everyone's love, and just it's super fun, I think, to be a part of like family events like that. So I love a lot of events for a lot of different reasons, but a real special place in my heart is reserved for those Noche Libre nights, especially around 2019.
Yeah, with Noche Libre, can you just talk about like how you all came together? Who also who else is in the group?
So great question. The initial three was Luz, and then Fabio Reina from She Shreds and Reina Tropical, and also like Savila locally. I think that's all their bands. And so it was us three on that first night at Holocene. And then really short after, I think maybe the next event, DJ Black Daria was a part of the lineup. And then shortly after it was Diana, DJ Diana, her name, she changes it a lot, so I don't know what her DJ name is right now. Um, but in total, there's like 7 of us or 8 of us. However, as of like last week, everyone but 3 people now live in LA. So everyone lives either in LA or Janae lives in Mexico City. And so currently, right now in Portland, Oregon, you have DJ Mommy Miami, which is me, DJ La Paushi, which is Paulina, and DJ La Tati, which is Tatiana. And so we're kind of holding it down. I think we're in a period of inadvertent hiatus and rebuilding and thinking about what does it look like if the majority of original members have kind of moved on or are living in different places. I would love to see it grow again and bring on new members, but I think that in order to do that, I also want to see like a lot of more infrastructure and just energy there. And it's just hard, right? When you have so many people who are really busy, a lot of, not a lot, but some of our members are also like parents. And so their, you know, attention is really stretched, or a lot of us are also working artists where we have multiple jobs and are balancing a lot of things. So it's a challenge, but I still have hope and faith that we'll kind of rebuild and see. One of the things we've also been thinking about is like how do we create spaces that continue to center music, but that aren't built on getting paid more if more people drink. A lot of our relationships with bars where we've had residencies, there's like a base structure, but then often it's a percentage of bar sales. And as we're kind of like, I think maybe growing and thinking about our relationship also to like alcohol, right? Like that isn't necessarily what we want centered in our event. Not that you can't drink, it's just like, how do we create a space that um, we are getting taken care of as artists, and so are the folks who are attending. So it's something that I'm just thinking about and hoping that I'll have more space and time to think about. But as we've been talking about, the working artist life is like very busy.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dilemma. I think about it in a similar vein in regards to especially like sports journalism now, because so many things that are like, I mean, actually the large companies as well, but so many of like the new ventures or the startups, like you'll notice is like, and this is sponsored by DraftKings or this is sponsored by whatever gambling company, and like it's ubiquitous in a way that I didn't really recognize until I was talking with a friend who's struggled a little bit with like a gambling addiction, and was like saying like, yeah, how actually like concerning it is, and this is just like, oh, every quarter we're going into like, here's the bet, Charles Barkley is placing,
Mm-hmm.
also knowing like Charles Barkley has a history of a gambling addiction as well, and
Mm-hmm.
an interesting thing. But anyways, yeah, just that like the conundrum, because you you need like the business model, you need the money, but like
Yeah.
how do we also make that happen while trying to transition into other,
Mhm.
ways to generate that revenue? And it's like we're all in that struggle. And again, like there's the journalist angle to that as well. And I'm going to circle back to that. Before I couldn't talk about, you know, your DJ background without asking, as far as like with the name Mommy Miami, like what is the origin of that?
It's always a disappointment to people because people think I'm from Miami. So I'm not from Miami, contrary to what my name is. I grew up in the Bay Area. Um, Honestly, the origins are that one day I was making up a drag persona with a drag persona creator tool from RuPaul's Drag Race on the internet, like circa BuzzFeed, quizzes and stuff like that. Um, and I decided at that point to just have a drag persona be Mommy Miami because it was the same letters all jumbled up, and it was like this pretty flamboyant, amazing Latina drag queen persona. I never became a drag queen. It was just like a random fun activity I did on the internet. And then I used that name for when I was a DJ at X-Ray because I wanted to not use my own name. I just liked the legitimacy I felt like of having a DJ name on a radio show. And then it just stuck. But I do think that having now been to Miami, and also just thinking about just like Miami's reputation and the demographics of being like very diverse as far as like different people from different countries in Latin America and a lot of Spanish and kind of flamboyant culture. I feel like it fits sort of for the vibe that I'm going for as a DJ. Although I also like to play like punk and other genres that aren't necessarily in this mommy Miami vibe, but I think it represents, the essence, or as the youngins would say, the aesthetic. Maybe that's not even young anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm absolutely the wrong person to ask.
We should know because we work with kids, but
In theory, but also I feel like in working with kids, like is mostly just a reminder of like, wow, these are my 30s. Like
exactly.
but yeah, speaking of working with kids, again, we talked about WITS, or the Rise in Schools program, earlier. And for that, I do a lot of journalism classes. I know you've done creative nonfiction, journalism. You also have journalism background as well. And you'd mentioned just yeah, you mentioned writing earlier, but can you just talk about like, it's always interesting for me as far as having been, has it been, how long has it been now? Like it's weird to think like I graduated in 2011,
Mm,
and just the journey there. But it's interesting always to see people who, like, there's a lot of people who I've met like more in like firmly in a journalism space, and then just like the way the industry is where it you know does not make a lot of money. I know, like when I was telling people when I first got into freelance, it was like part of it just happened to be a, I don't know about a happy accident, but an accident where it's like the same money I was making as a full-time reporter I could make
mm.
just taking a shot on this, which is to say not very much at all. But yeah, can you just talk about as far as even just like with journalism related projects, like how much, if you're able to do at this juncture versus different points in your career?
Yeah, my transition to self-employment was because I wanted to be a freelance writer, more like full time. I had always kind of been contributing to Bitch Media ever since my internship in 2012. I read a couple articles a year, probably like a dozen, maybe sometimes. I have things from like cultural criticism to music and film reviews. And then, I just at one point was like, I'm gonna try to work full time because I need like benefits and maybe a little I can be one of those people who are creative and they have their full-time job, but then they do their creativity like off the clock. And so I had a full-time job in tech for a while and then saw different people I know going full-time freelance and being like, "Hey, if they can do it, maybe I can do it." So I made this transition. It was like a year of planning where I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna make my rent costs be cheaper, and then I'm gonna have 2 nannying jobs at the time to make sure my rent and my utilities and all that sort of my bills are covered. And then I'm gonna supplement with freelancing and sort of see how I can take away those, non-writing related jobs in order to focus more on writing." And for a while, I was like really doing it, and then I like slowly started to take away some of those nannying jobs, and I also started working at Literary Arts at Writers in the Schools in a staff position, like 10 hours a week, and that kind of helped with creating some of the stability because at first I was just pitching articles to as many publications as I could. There was like no recurring gigs and I was like, okay, maybe the next step is to figure out how to like write a column, right? So I have some recurring income. But it was a struggle and there was definitely a period of time where that was my main focus of just trying to make it work. But through a series of like one time for a week, I just did a time tracking activity where I was like, how long does this actually take me to write this article from the very inception to the very end, right? From not only interviewing people, but at that time I was doing all my own transcription, um, writing the article, revising it, right? Posting it on social media to share it. And when I did the math, it was like $5 an hour. Um, and I was like, I think this is ethically wrong anyways. Like how like I can't subject myself to that. And I think that was even like before taxes. So it's been a really rough, I think, journey to realizing what is and isn't worth my time because I've like learned I kind of the hard way, right? Of like I'm trying to make a living, I'm working all the time, but it's barely enough to, cover my bases and I'm burnt out, right? And so I started to kind of plan a pivot away from journalism after having, even some success with like switching from low paying gigs to like better paying gigs. It just still was really challenging, I think, to manage all those different deadlines, all those different relationships, invoicing, right, all the administrative side, and also the emotional side um, of just constantly being on. I think that's something that I don't really hear enough people talk about, but as a journalist, I feel like you're just constantly thinking like, what is this story? Could this be something I pitch? Like, what format would I want to, present this story in? And it's just a lot to have that constantly running every day, no matter what you're doing. And over time, I've pulled away. I still do some journalism, but definitely it's, maybe like 20%, if that. And it's primarily working with Travel Portland now, which is like travel writing. Occasionally there's like what I consider more like journalism where I'm like interviewing people, but travel writing, copywriting, and every once in a while someone will reach out and I might, do something that's a little more of a deep dive. Like I recently wrote about the Columbia pool, the closure of that pool for the University of Portland's magazine, their like college magazine. And that was really fascinating because I got to talk and learn deeply about a community pool, the significance of it, the history of it, how it affects the community when there are closures from, folks who have mobility issues, who are older, right? Or maybe not, they've had an accident, right? To children who become unsafe around pools, right? Like there's very big impacts that I would have not had the opportunity to learn about and write about were it not for this journalism opportunity. Um, and so I'm really glad that I do occasionally get to do it because I think what I love about journalism is the ability to connect, the micro everyday stories to the macro world of like, how does this affect a community? How does it affect, you know, our country, how we live as people, humans, right? There's so much that happens every day that journalism at its best can slow down and like get you into that and understand those connections and the significance of things. I love research too, right? And talking to people. I just wish that it was more sustainable and paid people well and took good care too of all the again like the mental load of it too.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up just like that emotional aspect of trying to do journalism work in this economy, in this situation, whatever you want to call it, because like you said, like you're always on,
Mhm.
and I feel like maybe this is just me, but I feel like you're constantly having to defend why this is important when it feels obvious and people genuinely actually agree. Yet, like you said, like to get, even when you say that, like, I guess when I say that, I should say, is like when you talk about like making it sustainable, because that's really like we can say like this, people will mostly agree like, hey, this information, this is good to know. I'm glad I know this is helpful literally to as as the peer in the field calls it, like the information health of our society.
Mhm.
But also it's like if we're not paying people, you know, like the actual work requires, if people have to struggle to just to get this information out. And like you said, like it's funny when you tracked or when you talked about this, like tracking like how much am I actually doing as far as like time versus the pay for this, and came out to like $5 an hour. Because I recently had a conversation with some people about a project from way back when, which is actually very pivotal for me. But when I was just looking back on like what were the rates, what was I taking for that, and it's like it was horrifying. Like, and I understand why, because it was a very different point in my career. And you're just, when you're trying to establish yourself, especially as like a freelancer, you like say like, I can do this to build to bigger things. But it's also, when I think about just the effects, and like how many people, like I was mentioning earlier, who were pretty firmly planted in the journalism field, were known throughout the area, the region, for their journalistic work, who just like had to just pivot away. I mean, myself included in a lot of ways, uh, because just again, it's not sustainable. Like, and what again, like, what are the effects of that on our society, on our communities? Because we all keep saying like, "Hey, this is important," but we keep watching like the deterioration around us. We keep seeing the effects of this lack of information, or this lack of engagement with information.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's dire. It's very very dire.
It is, and I mean, even it's like, the function of journalism is to inform, right? It's to tell folks about things that they should know about, to know about what's happening not only locally but globally. And it's also just really, I think there's like a lot of also ethical dilemmas that I've had too as a journalist, where if, in my heart of hearts, what I hope for when I report on something is that maybe there's a policy change or someone who has the funds, right, to maybe, you know, sponsor more investigative journalism or help, the families that I'm, highlighting, especially with some of the work that I've done with folks who are living on Social Security or who are refugees and who are really in just like dire situations. Um, and it's like the emotional also aspect of spending a ton of time, right? Maybe on a particular piece, and maybe you do have the finances that someone has funded this project, but then when the project gets published, there isn't traction, there isn't policy change, there isn't wide circulation, you don't get those clicks. Then it also feels like, what was this for? Who is this for? If we just read these things and don't take any action, or they're not getting to representatives who can make action happen, then is it harmful to be bringing up these stories where folks are recounting their traumas and all this in like this public arena if we aren't actually able to help, right? Like I don't know, I just struggle with that aspect as well. And I being in the like being comfortable living in the gray of like, I understand like why certain things are the way they are, um but it's just complicated. I don't think that journalism is unimportant, right? And also, how can we make it not only sustainable for journalists, but also the subjects, the people that we talk to that are being focused on, and um, trying to also just kind of combat the whiteness of it and the impetus to like assume that journalists of color are not are unbiased or are biased, and that there even is this unbiased, right? There's always like layers to it. So it's a complicated question and answer, I think, as to why people move away from journalism. But it also is like it is another industry that has been shaped and continues to be shaped so much by a lot of the problems that exist in this world.
Yeah, that dynamic where you don't where it doesn't feel like you're getting the traction once the story comes out is so real. And it's I know I'm sure you have the same experience where put out the story, it doesn't get the traction you're looking for, and then like years later, people will come up to you and be like, "That was so important, though. That was so," or especially like if you've moved on from different publications or you've moved on from like things that are as forward facing, and be like, "Oh man, I miss that. I really miss that," and it's like, I don't for me it'd be like bittersweet because it's like, well, I'm glad maybe just because I'm like starved for like thinking this, meant anything. So I'm happy for the recognition, but also I don't know, it's when you have that happen over and over again, it's just like it's frustrating. Like to
Yeah.
your point about like the problems. I mean, I think about it's such a deeper thing as far as just like how does like when this is a business, so like consumerism is part of it, but also the patterns, the most toxic parts of consumerism, which in itself is a toxic thing, are also very much like controlling this and dictating this and like, yeah, how it affects coverage, how it affects, again, like why people leave journalism, how, again, to things that are probably bigger than this interview, but just how journalism has become like one of the ground zeros for disaster capitalism. And we don't talk about it nearly
Mhm.
enough because that in itself would be journalism that isn't sustainable. I
I
love this
mean,
circle.
right. Right, and even the whole model of like then, outlets try to get people to pay to read the articles, but I'm like, that is like that should not be that's like the oxymoron of what journalism is. Like you're supposed to give information, but I understand again that like you need it to be sustainable. It's yeah, there's so many layers here. And I mean, I will just say like I'm gonna take the wins whenever I can get them. So anytime a reader does say, hey, this connected with me. Or I recently had a student from, I think they were from U of O, reach out to me about an article I wrote for about Ontario, Oregon, and it was a series I did. And they wanted to do a quick interview because they had like this class assignment where they're like proposing how a grant could be used, and like they're like, I don't know if the grant will really come through, but that was really cool to be like, hey, someone out there has read. Basically, if you search Ontario, Oregon, my name pops up a lot regarding coverage because it's a small community that doesn't get a lot of coverage. And I had the honor of spending many weeks there over a few different stretches of time. But that was great, to at least feel like for those people, I don't know, I'll never quite know what the outcome was, and also trying not to sort of be in the capitalism trap of like maybe if they can't get financial support from someone, or I don't know if they will, right? Maybe there's like also the emotional importance of them feeling like someone listened to them and heard them and gave them a platform, right? Like, exposure doesn't pay the bills. And also there's also real human connection that has happened, in those spaces of journalism with people. And so I just like try to stay positive even with all the crap that surrounds journalism, right? Because it is so important and the stories are important, and I just um, hope something will change for the better.
Yeah, yeah. I'll try to take some notes on staying positive. That sounds
Hard,
like
hard out here.
yeah, yeah. But to that point about mentioning teaching though, I'm curious, like, just a little backstory for the viewers. My foray to teaching is actually directly in part to you and
Mhm.
literary arts with these yeah, working with writers in the schools. But I'm curious as far as, in your path to doing teaching workshops, again, writing, to all topics across the board. Like, was that was that like always a plan, or was that kind of like something that just happened?
Teaching is my first love. Maybe writing is too, but teaching was my first, this is my career path and I'm gonna do that. So my undergrad is the degree is in child and family studies in the School of Social Work, but I had a minor in elementary ed and essentially was learning from all these sort of different disciplines about children and youth and families. And my goal was to be an elementary ed teacher. And so a lot of what I've been able to do later, I think has come from this foundation of not only just like understanding like the history of families and how to teach, and because I took a lot of classes on how to teach different subjects, which was really helpful. I also, my partner was a language arts teacher for 5 years in Portland Public Schools. And so he also has been really helpful to me when I was kind of first trying to do independent workshops or plan a curriculum for writers in the schools. That was really helpful because he would help me, yeah, plan that curriculum and make sure that things were all kind of like leading to each other, scaffolding as we call it. So I had the opportunity to learn a lot of how to be a good teacher. And I think every time I teach a class, I'm constantly learning and looking for feedback on how to like continue to improve as a facilitator and like a sharer of the creative space that we're engaging in together. But I love teaching. I love the opportunity to kind of like journalism, just deep dive into a particular niche or subject. I like to get people excited, especially the challenge of doing that with writing in a high school where you're forced to be there, which is very different than, adults who self-select to reconnect with their creativity or something. It's a totally different sort of ballpark, right? And there's different challenges, but I feel like in any space there is so much, I don't know, that I get to learn too when I'm teaching, and kind of like journalism, like hearing people's stories and connecting with them, and just even what you said of like, hey, maybe we had a conversation and then you started teaching with wits. Like, I don't know, I never know what the ripple effects are of the exchanges that I have with students that I have. But if it's, anything that helps push them in whatever direction that they want to go, like I think that's a win. So I love teaching, and I will also start teaching at PNCA in January, teaching in the MFA and the critical studies MA, teaching a creative writing class for them. So it's like all of my things have come full circle where my sort of undergrad, which is also kind of critical studies in some of my classes, plus the writing are like coalescing together. So I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, and you mentioned the MFA. You just talk about your decision because that was more recent, but like as a writer who's already teaching, already it's already out there. Like, what made you want to go back and get the MFA?
My my dreams of being a writer were always kind of there, but I never saw it as a potential career path and didn't really know what it would look like to try to do that in an academic setting. So, like I said, I opted to focus on education, even though when I was about to graduate, I knew that I wasn't going to do that full time either, just because of the burnout. And then, haha, I became a journalist and burnt out. So I just, that's kind of there for me. But um, enrolled in my MFA the month before Funeral for Plaka came out, too. And I had always wanted to study writing at this deep level, and I also felt like I was kind of plateauing. Like I loved the Independent Publishing Resource Center program that I did, where I created, the basically draft chapbook of for Flaca. But I have been struggling to write this memoir that I'm almost done redrafting finally, but since 2012, and I felt like okay, I've like learned how to write essays and articles, and I can write books, and I'm still struggling with doing this memoir. And I feel like maybe if I have a community that's encouraging, that can help me see writing in a different way, and also give me the language to talk about my writing in a different way, then maybe it'll be worth it. And so basically, it was a gift to myself that I had always kind of wanted to study writing, and I finally did it, and it was the most amazing experience. I feel really lucky that I waited so long. I did a low residency model, which meant that instead of kind of uprooting my life and moving to a program full time in a different place, I chose this route where I would go twice a year for 10 days. And it was a little more expensive, but um, ultimately, I felt like it was training wheels for how to be a working artist and a working writer where you're squeezing writing into your daily life. You're not in this like temporary space where you only focus on writing, but it has to fit into the rest of your life. And that didn't exist. This program specifically didn't exist when I was first looking at MFAs back in the day. And it's called Randolph College, and the faculty is super diverse, super queer, and mostly BIPOC, and it's like the perfect place to have done my MFA. So I'm very grateful that I stuck with that goal, even though it felt scary to like take on debt again and to yeah, figure out how to squeeze that into my life. But it was definitely the right move, and I'm still finishing my work, but the thesis was focusing on that memoir, so it's almost there.
Yeah, well, that it will get done, you know.
Yeah.
But to the other point about, we're talking about wits and, kind of you being the one just kind of like put me on to that. I think another big part, honestly, being like a working artist of color in Portland, Oregon, I imagine the region at least is, supporting each other just straight up. And I think another, again, project where we intersect is, is Portland in Color. And that is very much about that. But can you just talk about like one, the origin, yeah, origin of Portland in Color and kind of like the mission of the work you and Celeste do with that?
Yeah, so Portland in Color originally was a photo series started by Celeste Noche. She's a photographer and was doing a portrait series of artists in their spaces, and interviewing them about what it was like to be artists of color in Portland, right? And to dispel the narrative or push back against the narrative that Portland is super white and homogenous by highlighting the stories of these different artists in Portland. And from the start, she always gave a small stipend and then also plugged, how to support these artists. Here's their Venmo, give them a tip. And so there was always kind of like that financial livelihood aspect of the work. She reached out to me to get support because she had been struggling to get grant funding and wanted to expand the series because it was originally just like a passion project out of her own pocket. And together we came up with the idea of a website with a database where folks who didn't have the opportunity to be focused on and highlighted in the narrative part of the project could still be featured on the website. And it also became then a tool for hiring and to also fight back against the statement like, I just don't know any artists of color, right? The great easy excuse, right, that people use, white people use when they want to make excuses for hiring all white staff or all white contractors, right? So that's kind of what started it. And then we started to do a lot of events and it really, really, really took off in that same year, kind of like 2018, 19. And then the pandemic happened and, similar to Noche Libre, similar to so many folks and artists, it was like a period of hibernation and regrouping. But we have continued to administratively support Portland Color, have some events, and are just kind of working on, again, the sustainability piece because so much of that work has been done from with us as like volunteers. And also, there's a couple other organizers who are pretty frequently at our meetings who help and support and direct events. And we just established the board, which we are now intersect on formally because you are our board president. And that is going to be a huge step in helping us figure out kind of what's the direction moving forward and how do we, again, continue to serve our mission, which is to support the creative livelihoods of BIPOC artists in Portland through events, through hiring, right? Through all these different methods, through amplifying, through storytelling. But also, how do we do that sustainably as a nonprofit, right? From switching from actually just this website and grassroots thing to a formal nonprofit, and making sure that we have capacity and can also not one day but soon hire someone to help manage that project as well too, because it's something that we both really love and care deeply about. And Tara Lynn Fay is the other person who works on it as well. But all of us are doing it in addition to our full-time work as artists.
Yeah, well, one, thank you for mentioning the board position. It's an honor to serve. And then also, I think it's just when we talk about like the actual nuts and bolts, the process of, again, making these things sustainable, especially when, again, like a lot of people will say, not to be the rain cloud constantly, but it's like a lot of people will say, oh, we support this, or like you said, like we just don't know any artists of color, we don't know any writers of color, we don't know any editors of color, and it's I mean, one, not really true. It's just like you don't remember all 8 times where people threw all the writers of color, editors of color in your face explicitly because you asked, and then you just didn't care and moved on. But that's a whole other story.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's just the matter of like nonprofit management in itself. And again, keeping things sustainable, keeping things ethical,
Mm-hmm.
and all that is, it's easier said than done, especially when, if you're doing something, like if you're actually trying to support artists of color and support and empower artists of color, that's not, it's not directly going to tie into some most likely rich white benefactors' direct interest or desires. So, again, like the verbal support you will see is not going to match likely the financial support.
Right.
So how do we like, on one hand, it's this big obstacle, but on the other, you know, I'd like to, for me, trying to be the optimist, look at it as like there's the positive, like we're actually going through this process of building what we want to see, like not building a conversation around it, not building a little activity around it, but like actually building that thing. And like it's hard, but it's not just worth it, it's necessary, you know?
Exactly. It's definitely a challenge, but um, I'm so grateful for a community that has come through, like you, like other folks on the board. And I think that, you know, even with with the project of Portland Color, with the project of Noche Libre, with whenever these projects feel like they um, are in like a hibernation or sort of like regrouping, I think it's just kind of, I feel like nature doing its thing, where like, the winter and the time we're in right now, right? The rain's coming. Sometimes things just need to slow down a little bit. And in those quiet moments, I think those seeds can be planted. We can regroup. So things can bloom again. And I definitely feel that way with Portland in Color, especially with, I think, what it means to have a board and to have support with things like strategic planning, which as an artist who fell into this, like I don't have admin training in that way. Not that it has to be in this formal way or it can only be one way, but it is so much nicer when you have a team of support to have, everyone brings their own expertise to work on something together. And I'm just all for as much community help always. And I wanted to offer that too, right? Through teaching and through other spaces that I get to be a part of as an organizer as well. So I just believe it's like mutual and hopefully we'll all come around, right?
Oh, for sure, for sure. So, Emily, I want to thank you again for being so generous with your time today. Before I let you go, I like to ask everyone I interview for this project, what is something in the world of art, like across any medium that you are not working on, since we've spent this time talking about the various different projects. But yeah, what is something in the world of art that you're not working on that is inspiring you right now, or just giving you, putting that battery in your back, if you will?
Well, another thing, I mean, let's see. I feel like I'm not someone who is in really the visual art world very much. So lately on Instagram, I've been seeing a lot of updates from Crow's Shadow, which is the artist residency on a native reservation in Oregon. It's the only one, and that's really amazing to see just some of the printmaking that happens out of there. I am also very inspired right now by video games. And I think about the artistry a lot in video games where, there's sort of like a technical side of like how do you get the thing to work on the device, but there's also the storytelling component and all of the visual art and the music that goes into making a video game what it is. So that is kind of the world that I'm in right now is like Instagram, arts, inspiration, and playing a lot of Stardew Valley. And otherwise, just always, right, going to readings and music and trying to like be a person outside of just my home when I am not working.
It's funny you mentioned video games. Like, I feel like every few years, even though I don't think, yeah, I don't really, maybe sometimes I go like an arcade or something very, every once in a blue moon type thing. But it's like, even though I don't play video games nearly as much as I used to when I was younger, it's like, it's always kind of like in the back of my head, I would like to like write the script for a video game one day. I don't even know what it would be or particularly why I want to do that, but it's just like,
That's
just like as a writer,
cool.
it would be, yeah, it feels like a fun thing,
Yes.
just to do in the various mediums, to be like, yeah, yeah, I did the script for, you know, whichever. Again, I don't play video games, so I have no references coming off the top of my head whatsoever. But I don't know, like for like some RPG or something, it would
Yeah.
be fun.
I just learned through writing an article for Travel Portland on the like retro video game composium or something like that. Compose symposium. Um, that there is the Portland Independent Game Squad, aka Pig Squad, and there's a lot of indie gamers and developers in Portland. So I'm not familiar with this community sort of directly, but there's a huge culture of folks who either are modifying games and making their own twists like mods, or they're making their own video games and will teach you how to do that. So I think there's a space here in Portland for that. If that's something that you want to do, maybe we'll collab on a video game sometime.
Hey, I'm for it. I'll say I have some questions about the Pig Squad name, but that's that that is neither here nor there for this. um, yeah, Emily, thank you so much again for taking the time and just sharing all your insights on all these stories, and just yeah, being very candid as far as like the financials of it, and the real the things that really like dictate our decisions in this arts world. Because it's important. I think you mentioned like the celebrations earlier, and it's very important to like document that and have that joy in this, because so much of it's a slog. But then also to balance that with just like letting people know what this really is and what this really takes, and how much we put into you know sharing our work with the world.
Definitely. Well, thank you again for all that you do, Bruce. You're always highlighting so many artists and documenting not only your own work, but the work of so many folks in Oregon. So it's an honor to, again, be able to collaborate with you in this space. And definitely being a writer and speaker and teacher and DJ takes a ton of like administrative work and financial work. But it's also, fueled by community. And I'm just honored to do it, even through the moments where I get burned out and need to hibernate and regroup. So um, I'll be hibernating for a little bit, but then looking forward to a strong 2024, full of collaboration and more collab with you.
Yeah, yeah, likewise, not just on the collaboration, but just definitely scheming on some hibernation of my own. So I feel that
May we all
deeply.
have time for hibernation.
Right, right. Well, yeah, Emily Prado, thank you again for taking the time.
Thanks.